co-authored event with the Open Governance Hub, and we decided to try this venue out to see if we could attract some different audiences than the ones we usually have at CIMA over at the old Woody's building. We were very happy that Nathaniel Heller suggested this cooperation as a way to reach out to some of the people who are in this very interesting space here. And it's an opportunity for us to see if we can start a dialogue with some of the different communities around Washington. So we decided to take this very important conversation into this environment, and we'll see how it goes. We are live broadcasting this event, so those of you who are watching while we're doing it, you can send questions to the hashtag MediaDev, and we will be, after the live stream, we will be posting this online. So I hope this will generate much more conversation as we go along. I know that some people in Europe are planning to watch this either live or after it's posted online. And the topic is of enormous interest to people around here. Today we're going to be talking about the question of nonprofit media, and are some of the examples that we're starting to see working so well, particularly in this country, a model that can be replicated elsewhere in the world. We're in a media environment right now where a lot of the experimentation with media institutions is not going very well. Countries are having enormous difficulty establishing sustainable, independent media. The media is being captured either by governments or by private sector players who are trying to influence the government. And it means that a lot of countries do not have the kind of important independent voices in order to stimulate development and create possibilities for improving their lives. And this is a big worry for people who care about international development and for democratic development, because without free media, the potential for continuing growth and improvement in societies is severely limited. We have a star panel with us today. To my left is Dick Toffel, who is the founding general manager of ProPublica. He's been there since 2007, and he's currently the organization's president. He was formerly the assistant publisher of the Wall Street Journal, my alma mater, and a vice president of Dow Jones. So we actually worked together, though we were in very far away places from each other. To his left is Chuck Lewis, who is another important voice in this debate. He's an investigative journalist and former ABC news anchor and 60 Minutes producer. He's the founder of several nonprofit organizations, including the Investigative Reporting Workshop at American University, and before that, the Center for Public Integrity and its international consortium of investigative journalists. So he's been involved a lot on the international side of this debate. And then Tim Carrington is another colleague from Wall Street Journal, former Wall Street Journal journalist and development specialist who also worked at the World Bank. He is the author of the report that you saw out there on Malaysia Kini, which is a really interesting hybrid example of a news organization that has managed to make it in a really, really difficult world. And it brings to the surface some of the difficult issues that all of these ventures face in difficult environments. So we're going to be talking today about both what we have learned in this country from investigative journalists and nonprofit journalistic organizations, and the lessons that we can draw for that for the international world. Start just by asking Dick if he can tell us a little bit about why ProPublica got started. What was the reason that this came up when it did, and what role do you think it has played in American journalism?
Okay. Thanks, Mark, and thanks for having me. Very glad to be here today. So nonprofit journalism had been going on for a long time in the United States, and actually probably more responsible for starting it and getting it serious than anybody else in the world is Chuck Lewis. Who founded half of the nonprofit journalism organizations that existed in this country in about 2006. And you've taken a census of them, sort of about half had been founded by Chuck Lewis and half had been founded by somebody else. I think that's literally true. It took off, however. I was at a conference recently at the City of New York Journalism School, and somebody, his name has blown out of my head, but he did a brilliant presentation about what makes nonprofit startups successful. And he'd done a serious, actually what makes startups successful. He'd done a serious study of them, and number one turns out to be timing. Not leadership, not concept, all sorts of other things that you might think. Timing. So the question is, why was our timing good? Because I think our timing was good. And the answer is because of the business crisis of the press. Certain kinds of journalism, I think, and I think we're all coming to understand this, had been subsidized in the old traditional model by the enormous profits that were swirling around everywhere. And when those profits, particularly about 2005, began to rapidly recede, and I think it now turns out rapidly and those things stopped getting subsidized. So Chuck, and I'll let him speak for himself, but I mean, he's written a terrific book about this called 935 Lies. This happened for different reasons, I think, in the American broadcast television business, which is still incredibly profitable. And that's what brought Chuck into nonprofit journalism. But I think what brought most people into nonprofit journalism is that the money wasn't there to sustain investigative reporting, for instance, or international reporting for an American audience, or in this country, state house reporting. And there are, I think, a rising number of other examples of areas that are the market's simply not going to produce, and I think there are obviously an increasing number of those areas around the world as well.
And do you think that did this have any impact at all on the overall environment for the news? Did it change any of the thinking about the people who were still trying to make it work with the old business model, or has it had any impact on the trajectory of that?
I think it's changed their attitudes enormously, right? I mean, when we announced the formation of ProPublica in the fall of 2007, we gave the story exclusively to the New York Times because it seemed like a smart way to get some attention, and it was. And so Bill Keller, who was then the editor of the New York Times, is quoted in that story as saying, "I don't know whether I'm going to take their stuff. I mean, you know, there's this guy Paul Steigner, and he used to run the Wall Street Journal, and he's in charge, but you know, I don't know, nonprofit journalism, it all seems a little funny, and we'll see." So fast forward 8 years, we've had 38 pieces in the New York Times in the last 12 months, but more to the point, Bill Keller is now running a nonprofit news organization post his retirement from the Times, focused on criminal justice, called the Marshall Project. So I think their attitudes have changed enormously. People adapt.
So where is it going? What is going to? Is it going toward a kind of hybrid model where organizations like ProPublica will play a role, and the traditional news organizations will still try to play some limited process in that environment, or do you think that we're moving toward something completely different than what we see right now? In terms of, because you're still being spread by organizations like New York Times and the NPR, and those guys are playing an important role in creating a platform for your success.
Yeah. I always have trouble looking too far out. I'm very, very dubious about 10-year business plans these days in our business. In commodity businesses, maybe that makes sense, although even there you've got things like fracking that probably ought to be a useful caution to, even the world's most traditional businesses can get upended pretty fast. Our business has been upended pretty much every year now for 10 years, so I would look out that far. I would say, as far as my eye can see, yes, I think it is going to be a hybrid of different kinds of organizations trying to fill gaps that the market has created. And an ever shrinking, I'm afraid, number of players who are left in the traditional space with the traditional range of ambition. I mean, the only news organizations, traditional news organizations, print, in this country that I know that I think have ambitions of the same scope that they did 10 years ago, are probably the New York Times and maybe now again the Washington Post after a period of not. And certainly NPR is as ambitious as it's ever been. But and then there are the wire services who are emerging to become more broad-based. But I think the vast bulk of traditional news organizations in this country are far less ambitious than they were, and the outlook would appear to be that they'll be less so next year and the year after that.
Yeah. Well, let's bring Chuck into this conversation. You've as Dick has said, seen this over a number of years now.
Right.
Yes,
sorry about that.
So you've seen the development of nonprofit journalism over a number of years now, and I think if you hold the button down longer, it'll eventually turn green.
We get a different color. There we go.
And it's obvious that this is producing something of quality, that this kind of approach is producing high quality outputs that are missing in other places that don't have this kind of journalism. It's an interesting model that people are paying attention to because of the outcomes, because of the results. So how do you see this moving? And then we'll talk a little bit about national.
Well, gosh, we can talk for a week about all these things. Well, I think it'll keep evolving, as Dick just said, with hybrid type things. The commercial entities, I agree with the description, and this is happening globally as well as U.S. That's an interesting development by itself. That's not necessarily fully understood by most journalists, I think. But the other thing is, in the U.S., the reason the model's different and the reason it works for enterprise journalism is because the time and space limitations are removed. There's not for many of these nonprofits, which now are over 100 in the U.S., doing public service journalism of various types. The time-space issue, there's not a need to have a first edition paper out at a certain hour. There's just not that mentality, and that frequently can impede enterprise when it comes to doing serious journalism that's going to require months or even sometimes years even. And so I think that's one of the reasons that this has flourished. In part, it's not the only reason. It did coincide with the end of the papers going public, which is roughly 65 and 95. The first centers in America start First one is in the Center for Investigative Reporting for these kinds of centers. Nonprofit journalism goes back to AP in 1846, as you know, and Christian Science Monitor in 1908, owned by a church, and NPR, which is, of course, publicly funded to some extent in 1970. So, and National Geographic and all these other incarnations. We've always had nonprofit journalism. The idea that it's new, we should be cautious about, because it's actually not. For investigative reporting, that really starts with the Center for Investigative Reporting. 4 unemployed journalists decided to create a thing called the Center from one of their homes in Berkeley, Lowell, Berkeley. And then the Center for Integrity in 1989, in my case, from my house. And one thing led to another. Now we are at 100 throughout the U.S. and over 40 states, I think. And I think it's there's several things that have happened that explain that phenomenon before we go international for a second. Why all these parts of the country? Well, because most of the funding that has not come from media foundations. That's actually the misunderstanding. Most of the philanthropic funding has come from other foundations who realize if you don't have information, you don't have a community. If you don't have a community, you may have missed some issues with this thing called democracy. And it's rather, and so literally hundreds of foundations and hundreds of millions of dollars has moved into the space because they realize that the traditional news that was presented by the commercial realm has waned. I would put that as an understatement. In the last 10 or 15 years, and for all kinds of reasons Dick was explaining. And then you asked in the context of international, it has been moving and gradually growing. You're seeing various signs. The first known, I did a big thing on this a few years ago about all these. I profiled 4 nonprofits on 3 continents. And the oldest one outside the U.S. that I'm aware of is the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism, started by Sheila Cornell and 8 other women journalists in Manila, which later brought down a president with its reporting. Magnificent group, very courageous group. Which staved off everything from death threats to lawsuits, but has done magnificent work. And then the Romanian Center for Investigative Journalism in Bucharest. And so you start to have these things sprouting up in various places. In Britain, you have the Bureau for Investigative Journalism, and you also have the Center for Investigative Journalism that Adam McFadden runs. And you start to have these other things. Now, the problem with the ones which we were talking about earlier is they don't have a big tradition because of the tax laws, which we were talking about before this started today. The tax laws are less beneficial to folks who want to support this kind of work, and also the reaction and the trajectory of the media, while it is similar now in Europe as it is in the U.S., it was not always apparent only in the last few years. So I think there's slight differences, but I'm out. We're actually now at the workshop doing a survey of all the reporting centers. I know that the Center for International Media Assistance has tracked and done survey work by David Kaplan and others in recent years of all the funding, including research and training. Interested in the original reporting part of that, which is a very small subset of a few dozen. And I want to get a sense of how big are they, how well are they funded, where's the funding come from, what percentage of the funding is from the West, from the U.S. government, or from other private sources. And I don't know when this will be done, but we're in the midst of trying to do it. It'll probably be later this year. But I think what I am noticing, and I don't know what others here think, or what they think about this or others, is the extent to which, how many can there be, how many will there be, and what is the sense of it. I have the sense that it's increasing, but in a very cautious way. Whenever I'm a little bit of I have an occasionally impish side to myself, which I hate to acknowledge, but it's true. So when my overseas journalist friends say that they have a problem with their tax laws, and I'll say, gosh, so I guess you don't have any wealthy folks over here? And they go, oh, we have many people with you. And I said, do some of them like information? And I start to tease them gently. And they will grudgingly acknowledge, yes. And so now you're starting to see foundations emerge in Europe, in various places, and in Asia. And I'm not saying, I don't know, I think they always had wealthy enclaves that gave philanthropic charitable contributions for various purposes, and now maybe journalism will be one of them.
Well, Dick, can you say why this kind of funding matters to your organization's ProPublica? How does it function, and why is it important that it comes from these other private sources? I mean, what?
Yeah, because it's pretty simple, because it can't come from anyplace else. I mean, you know, we sell advertising, and there's advertising on every page of our site. And our traffic is way up. It was up 25% last year. It's up more than 50% the first quarter of this year. We'll do, I don't know, 2-point-something million page views this month. That's not trivial, but the advertising revenue from it is completely trivial. When we started, our then managing editor, my partner, our editor-in-chief, Steve Engelberg, said to me, so how big do we have to get before we can make a meaningful amount of money from advertising? And I said, well, this is 2008. Well, if we could get to 500,000 unique visitors a month, we could probably, we'd be in the game. So about 2010 or 11, we get to 500,000 unique visitors a month, and he's literally in my office, like the next day when we get this report, and he goes, I remember you said that in 2008. And I said, yeah, I know. So here's the problem. In the 2 or 3 years since I said that, they moved the goalpost to like 10 million unique visitors a month. And we're not going to get there. We're not going to get there as far as the eye can see. Advertising is not the answer. We sell data. We make a little money from that. That's nice. We sell ebooks. We sell audiobooks. We'll sell our content to you in pretty much any way you can dream of. It doesn't add up to a lot of money. And, some people think events are great, and in some smaller places, some regional centers, I think you can make a business out of that. In New York or Washington, it's very hard, right? Very hard. There's 1 million free events every day and every night, and to try to turn events into money, it's very, very difficult. So you basically sort of run through the list of revenue sources, and the answer is no, 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 no. Readers obviously would be the ultimate one, but there the experience is the only people who are able to generate any meaningful amount of money from readers, 2 I would guess. One is super high quality, super high volume sites like the New York Times. Except that honestly, there are very few entities that deserve the description like the New York Times. So that may so far consist of the New York Times. And even they aren't generating enough. And then NPR and its member stations and public television in this country, but they do it historically on the strength of people being willing to tolerate this business of, we're going to stop delivering content for the next week or 2, and you're going to agree to listen to us begging for money, which hallelujah people do. But as they transition online, I know from my friends in public radio and public television, it's one of the things they worry about the most, because online there is no reason to think people are going to be willing to say, thanks for coming to our website. For the next week or 2, it will pretty much just ask you for money rather than giving you content. That won't work. And yes, we do ask people for money on every page of our site, and it delivers some $500,000 a year last year, actually, in gifts by mail and online, so that's real, but compared to $12 million, it's not a lot. So the answer is, we need people philanthropically to give us money because we've tried every single other thing, and I don't see anything that's producing meaningful results for us, or frankly, for anybody else similarly situated.
And the way that you're set up, explain perhaps for the European and global listeners, why this allows you to be independent, the link between your funding and the ability to do the kind of work that you do.
So why are we enthralled to our donors? Is the
Right.
question. Yeah, it's a very important question. I think the answer is you have to manage this carefully, but I've always thought that almost all of the answers come by analogy to the relationship between traditional publishers and traditional advertisers. You had to worry a lot in the traditional publishing business about not being in control of your advertisers. There are rules for the separation of church and state and what doesn't. And they're critical, and I think most of them throw off analogous answers in the nonprofit world that work pretty well. We can talk more about that as we go along if people want. But I've always found most of the answers by analogy.
And before we go to Tim, I want to ask you one more question. We've learned in the analysis, and there have been 2 Nobel Prizes, one on the role of information and media in the economy. We know that information is really critical to making economies work. We also know that it's critical to the democratic process. And we've always assumed that information had a pretty high value, that the participants in the markets and the people who are, out there in the world making decisions every day, the consumers who are making decisions, the decision makers in the government and enterprises need a relatively open and well-stocked information environment. And it was always the media that produced this. It was, and it helped collate and make sense of all that stock of information. So why does that not get monetized? Why does the market not create a system by which it has value and gets realized in a market system?
Okay. I'm not sure I know the total answer to that, but why did the market stop advertising why information matters in terms of newspapers ads about how great information is and look what we did in this city or this town? Mm-hmm. Most of that, as the contraction occurred in the commercial newspaper world, those ads went out the window. Mm-hmm. As we started teaching science and math and not other things in schools, civics and other things about society itself, and the whole notion of democracy itself, I think some of that teaching has waned over time. And it's a very deep question you're asking, because it's not just about the market, it's about the regard that we hold in our society for important information. We know globally that information does help to impede corruption, and the exposing of corruption often results in the beginnings of the end, the curbing of corruption. We know that it matters. We know from the cliches that information is power. It matters. It's important to have. But it's also true that of the so-called elite commercial publications in the U.S., the upper 3 to 5% of American people access that information. Yeah. The rest of the country doesn't. And then we're shocked that the rest of the country doesn't get it. I'm always slightly amused by that. I don't know, I have a perverse sense of humor. So I think all these are related, is the bottom line. And we have had, I know this digresses slightly, but we've had instances in the last 2 or so years of the so-called private media, the ones where you pay a few $1,000s a year. In instances where certain stories weren't covered entirely, entire investigative teams were shut down. I think when you have the market forces and you solely rely on the market forces, you sometimes have issues with, frankly, investigative reporting. I mean, a lot of the folks, the Center for Investigative Reporting and the Center for Integrity, the key reasons they were begun is because of internal censorship in the TV networks and other commercial media, which we haven't talked about, but is that a relevant issue? It is. It's exactly why they were started. And so I think there are some in the public that actually get what I'm saying, and they actually look for alternative sources, and they don't want to read what they think the government said today. They want to, or yesterday, they want to read what is actually happening, which may not be the same thing. And so I think there's all kinds of other issues here. It's obviously an immensely complex issue, and the question is an important question. It's almost impossible to answer, which just makes it an even better question.
We'd make news here ourselves. Well, you know, Tim, you just finished writing for CIMA a report on Malaysia Kini, which is an example of a venture that managed to come into existence and make quite a splash somewhere in the middle of all of this. You know, with some advertising, with some donor support, including the National Endowment for Democracy, with a public service kind of mandate, and they're still managing to operate. What do you think what was the key to that? Is that not something that could happen in other parts of the world?
Well, I think every country presents a different set of deficits and challenges and possibilities, but I think that there are certain strains that are held in common across regions and across different kinds of economies. And you know, just some of the things that saying, referring to hybrids, filling gaps, adapting to things. I think that's something that all kinds of societies are somehow doing. And the Malaysia Kini story for me was an interesting that because it did involve this process of adaptation, improvisation, and maybe opportunistic innovation. And I think it's really all about that, of sort of identifying a gap. Now, Malaysia, you know, a pretty successful Asian economy, high internet penetration, 67%, something like that, literate public, and a highly constricted environment for media activity. Into this comes the internet, and it presents a dilemma of either you're going to be on the sidelines with respect to the information economy and the internet, or you're going to have to give up some control over the flow of information. You can't really have it both ways. And I think the interesting thing in Malaysia was that in 1997, and this was kind of the first opportunistic moment, you know, for these guys that started Malaysia Kini. In 1997, Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad promised in a speech in California that the government in Malaysia would leave the internet alone in terms of some of the fundamental ways of controlling traditional media, the licensing and the withdrawal of licenses and the, you know, environment of worry that if you did this and looked into these kinds of stories, you might not get your license renewed next year, and then you're out of business. The game's over. They wouldn't do that. And then they enshrined that promise in legislation. So two enterprising journalists in Malaysia decided to take advantage of that opening that said, well, this looks like the online space is going to be a little bit different than the traditional media space. What if we created a news organization that only operated there and was therefore not subject to these licensing and that level of control? Now, after a story got published, the reporters at Malaysia Kini were subject to the same kind of harassment. You're guilty of sedition, you published something that was sensitive, you were arrested, So all of that stuff happened after the fact, but it didn't, and they knew it was going to, but it didn't stop them from getting it started. So this was a kind of very timely opportunism. And I would say the spirit of innovation and adaptation has been at work continuously through this 15-year period in which Malaysia Kini built readership and also became sustainable by really being, every year, but I believe one, a profitable organization. They were rolling along with a lot of advertising from the internet sector, so internet companies were the bulk of their early advertising base. When the dot-com bust happened, they were in big trouble. It just dried up. It was a catastrophe. And so with advice from the Media Development Investment Fund, and this was kind of a crucial, NED was crucial, Soros was very important in the early days of helping it get started, but then the Media Development Investment Fund, which stayed with them and sort of provided strategic advice at key points like this moment when the advertising was just gone. They said, you need to be thinking about a paywall. Well, that was kind of scary. It was not what they wanted to do. It didn't sort of fit the mold, the model they had in mind of providing all this independently derived news at a small, reasonable price, or no price to get the advertising. But they were convinced that that was the way to go, and they found a formula for doing it for the English edition that they had, the multi-language editions coming out, and it worked. And I think the reason it worked had something to do with the hybrid identity of this organization. It was a news provider that people liked to read, but it was also a new idea that people wanted to belong to and invest in. And so in that respect, it's a very basic idea, independent news. But it was a hole, it was a gap in the way that ProPublica, finds a gap and finds people who want to support, activity in that gap. So people wanted to do the paywall, to have access to this. They even wanted to belong to it enough that when Malaysia Kini opened a new headquarters in Kuala Lumpur, people bought bricks and put their names and whatnot on the bricks. They raised $500,000 for their new building. So in that respect, it's kind of like, it's not just a news company. It's something akin to a community news organization, and because the presence of independently derived news is so rare, I think people did want to be there. It was even the case that when some of the adversaries, government and government-related, to Malaysia Kini's success, tried to undermine it by basically taking the content and making it freely available on the internet. That was kind of one of the tricks of, let's get at this organization. People said it may be free, but we'll choose to read it by paying. It didn't actually hurt them that much, which is interesting. So there is a sense of a community of readers that believe in what they're doing. And so that was part of what made the paywall work, although there could be more research, I think, on their audience and just what they want and how they see the organization and what their loyalty to the organization is really about. But I think that that has really been crucial. So again, it's the spirit of adaptation, improvisation, and very timely opportunism.
Well, I want to bring in the role of international donors into this conversation at this point, because we are in an environment in the media development community in this country and abroad that work with a set of dollars that come from international donors. mainly. And it's a very small amount of the overall development assistance, about 0.5% of the overall amount. Somewhere in the range of $500 to $600 million a year that goes into this. And a lot of the things that have been done with this money every year over the years have not really worked. It's been a really difficult environment, and you could say that international assistance has been very successful in perhaps keeping things from falling apart, or stemming the tide of takeover of the media by authoritarian governments and that sort of thing. But in terms of creating sustainable operating media systems, it has been very difficult, especially in the period after the first transformations, right after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. There were some good examples of really major changes at that time that were successful. Poland created a world-class media system that sustainable and works very well, but most of the other countries further to the east really struggled and didn't manage to do it. So should the international donors be looking at some of these models like Malaysia Kini, or like the kinds of things that you have talked about here? I mean, I agree with you, Dick, about maintaining independence when you're working with donor money. But if you had multiple sources of that money, and if it was organized well, couldn't this also be one of the things that could be offered as one of the solutions to this really difficult environment for information that exists, particularly in the poorest countries? Because the countries that need information the most are the ones that don't have it. And even in the middle income countries, the media environments are incredibly captured. What about the role of donors? Could they play a role in propagating these kinds of institutions? Who wants to jump in on that?
Well, I think it's tricky in that you could create a sort of donor journalism that would basically substitute itself for the real journalism of the place. A couple of things that jump out as you were talking about this that I encountered in Africa. One was at a time that the World Bank and a number of other international organizations were working with news organizations in Africa to accurately and responsibly and humanely report the AIDS crisis. So this was going on, this pandemic was huge, it was terrifying what was happening to these societies, and it was subject to misinformation and neglect, and the media was doing an absolutely terrible job of this in Africa. So a lot of people were mobilizing seminars that said, here's the information, here's how you need to understand what this virus is and the effect it's having on your economies and your societies, and you come back to us and tell us. And there were some very interesting discussions that resulted from that. But one of the things that happened as the international donors became more and more involved in this was that the news organizations themselves said to their journalists, their reporters, this is a UN story or a World Bank story or a USAID story, and if you're going to do a story on the subject of HIV/AIDS, they need to pay for it. We're not going to even give you cab fare to go somewhere to do something, a form of reporting that would result in that. And so there were other things like that where I remember being in Burkina Faso and taking a group of journalists to do something they had never done before, which was report on the rural economy where most people live, the agricultural situation and the rest. They never got out of the city. They never got out of the building, really. And so you said, okay, we'll provide the transportation, the links, the experts, and we'll get you all these places. And then they came back and they wrote some fairly interesting stories and then sent invoices to my horror to the World Bank to pay for the stories. And they said that was what their editors insisted they do. So
Yeah.
it's a little, so, I mean, I think you could end up with a hybrid model, but is that what we want?
Did you pay?
No.
You know, I think it very much depends on culture around the world, and which obviously varies enormously. In this country, I don't think public funding of journalism, of enterprise journalism, certainly investigative journalism, works. I have, said more than once to my friends at NPR News that I think that they would be much, much better off if they took the small amount of money they get from the government and gave it back. And I think a lot of them privately agree, and I think it's the stations get a lot more money, but they don't get it for content, and it's very different. And I think it's just a question of how to make that transition, but I think that's very awkward. And I think it's increasingly awkward, and I think it's actually probably below untenable in this country. And I don't think public funding of any sort in this country for that kind of journalism is going to work. We can talk about why people want. On the other hand, I recognize that in the country probably most similar to this one in the world, which is Britain, but which has a very different culture, it does work. Not perfectly, but it works pretty well. When people say to me, how could that be? The best sort of wise answer that I've been able to come up with is, if we had an unwritten constitution in this country, we'd have a civil war once a week. And in Britain, they have an unwritten constitution, and they haven't had a civil war in 400 years. So somewhere in there is the answer. The question is, how does that work in different cultures around the world? In some places, like Britain, it may, and other places, like here, it may well not.
These are maybe wild and crazy ideas, but I'm noticing things that are intriguing, at least, that I find encouraging. We don't call it media, and it's not really media or journalism, but I am intrigued with the Wikipedia model of $16 billion being generated annually from foundations, yes, but also large numbers, and I don't know the number, I think it's in the hundreds of thousands of people globally. What if there was an investigative Wikipedia that was some other ilk, but not this similar? The other thing I've noticed with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, which started in '97 and now has 185 what we call Jedi Knight journalists in 65 countries on 6 continents. It's very interesting what's happening now. There's 40 or more major media companies in in the world that now on a regular basis want access to what the consortium has. No one, the Center for Public Integrity, the publisher of it all, has never asked any of them to pay a fee. But at this point, I'm not sure they wouldn't pay. And so I think that the world's a pretty big place. There's an awful lot of upwardly mobile, well-educated folks who have some money, and I think the world needs this kind of accountability information. And I think some way or other it's going to happen, and there will be money for it, and it will come from private sources, whether it's foundations or individuals with the web and other things. And I don't know how it'll happen exactly, but it has to happen. It's not a, should this occur, it must occur. And so somehow, some way it will. And I can't explain it. It's not scientific, but I've seen evidence of it, I've seen glimmers of it, and I think government funding is essential to a lot of this. I recognize that and I respect it, and I think it's very useful. But I think some of it will also be of other types of money. So,
One word of caution though on the Wikipedia thing, because people bring it up. I haven't looked at this in a year or two, but a couple of years ago I looked at the numbers, and compared their usage numbers to ours and tried to figure out, what percentage of people they were converting to donors. And it was actually well smaller than the percentage that we were converting. What they were able to do is they just exist at such an immense scale, right, that even at very low conversion rates, you're talking about potentially serious amounts of money. That's great for them. The problem is there are very, very, very few organizations that exist, or even I think potentially could exist at that kind of scale.
In the case of the Philippine Center, the Romanian Center, the other international one, how did they get going? Where did they get their money?
I think in the case of the Philippine Center, there was definitely support from the U.S., from U.S. foundations. I forget exactly which one, but I think Ford and MacArthur and maybe others. The Romanian Center, it's a really good question. I'm not exactly sure. I think similarly there was some foundation money. There's certainly the money did not come from inside Romania. That part I think we're fairly clear on. But external funding, many parts of the media in that part of Europe are actually not only owned by folks that we don't want to be, it's offshore, et cetera. So investigating corruption in that part of the world is precarious, to put it mildly. And so I think it was similarly foundation funding, but I don't, what's interesting about the Romanian Center is because it's in Romania and where they got the funding. The Philippine Center had Western interest and Western support dating back to Marcos and other things, and that's more understandable. The Romanian one is more curious to me. But to be fair, it started from someone's apartment with 36 freelance writers.
Not a downtown Washington,
Yeah, right. It wasn't a fancy
apartment.
startup there.
Right.
It was a seat of the pants thing, which often these things are.
Yeah. Well, let's open it up to the audience, because I've been asking all the questions. I hope some of you will have more interesting questions than I had. Marguerite, yes.
Hi, I'm Marguerite Sullivan, a consultant, used to be at CIMA. So the topic listed was nonprofit journalism, and you're talking a lot about investigative journalism. So could you talk a little bit about nonprofit journalism, which my impression is it's booming. It could be one person. It could be a lot of local news isn't being covered anymore. A lot of it now is online through centers. How do you see that? Because there is a difference, and Malaysia Kinney does do more than investigative journalism.
Yeah.
And I'm not putting down investigative journalism, it's crucial, but I see in the world of nonprofit journalism that probably 99% of it is not necessarily investigative journalism, and that
I'm not sure that last point is right, but I think the rest of it is. I mean, in this country.
What role is it playing globally?
Yeah, as I tried to say just before, I think you're going to see nonprofit journalism wherever you have market failures. And you have market failures in different kinds of content sets. And that's going to depend locally. So some other examples in this country, you're right, state house journalism. I mean, we have this very strange phenomenon in this country. I don't know how many of you ever focused on this, where the state capitals of almost all of the largest states are not the population centers. And that is the reflection of a 19th century judgment that was a way to protect against the abuse of power, and it made a great deal of sense. But in the 21st century, the problem is that when the dominant metropolitan news organizations that are not in the capital city greatly retreat from their ambitions, one of the places they tend to retreat from is the state capital. And I think this is actually less true in, for instance, Massachusetts and Georgia, which are the exceptions to this rule, than in pretty much all the other largest states in the country, where the state capital is at some remove. So state house journalism is one. City hall journalism, for sort of the same reasons in microcosm, is another. Investigative journalism, which I think is well more than 5 or 10% of nonprofit journalism, particularly in America, I think is another, and I do think has particular importance to democratic governance for some of the reasons that Chuck was saying, in this country, one weakness where I think we've not had enough nonprofit journalism and could well use more is coverage of international affairs aimed at an American audience. And you see people say all the time, well, things have never been better for international news. If you want, you could just look at the BBC, which you couldn't do before, and you could look at the local national news provider, and particularly if you have some other languages, you can learn everything there is to know. Yes, but as you know, if you're being honest about it, most Americans don't have other languages, and most of them don't know where those other sources are, and most of them don't care all that much. And so for the ones that do, who are a very important part of our society, obviously making important decisions for us and that affect a lot of the rest of the world, there is an enormous deficit, particularly outside of the coasts, in serious journalism about international affairs for Americans. And there has not been. There's been some addressing of this on a nonprofit basis, but I think there's a very significant market failure. But again, I think it comes back to market failure, and that's going to play out around the world in different niches for different, again, cultural reasons. The State House thing is irrelevant, except where you have a federal system in the country. And then maybe irrelevant because they may have organized it differently. The investigative thing, I think, is going to apply pretty much everywhere, and then the rest of them, you'll see it pop up as it does. Hope that's helpful.
If I can just clarify one thing, thank you on Malaysia Yakini, because absolutely, the gap that Malaysia Yakini was trying to run towards was not investigative journalism, but just independent journalism. They have a business, they have business news, they have citizen news, newsmaking, and they have just what happened yesterday, but independently reported.
Hi, Joan Maurer from the BDG. I see my favorite people up there. Just in response to Dick's comment on government-funded journalism, I'm going to take a pass on what VOA does. I don't think they do investigative journalism, but I think Radio Free Europe, for instance, has done some incredible stuff. So if you're looking at how U.S. government-funded journalism investigates other countries, they often do a pretty good job. But that's not my question. My question is really sort of a hybrid to Chuck and Tim about how do you nurture investigative reporting in a culture, particularly in Africa, where corruption is absolutely, utterly rampant. I mean, it's down to the point of, in Tanzania, the journalists will tell me, well, we get $40 for covering the president and $30 for covering the challengers. So we all rotate so we can split the money. How are you going to, ICIJ is a fabulous example where you're having mentors, but how are you going to break that culture of corruption to really create independent, funded, I think people would pay for journalism in Africa. I just don't think there is any good stuff.
No, Africa has got the worst issues in the world when it comes to journalism. As we all know, they have the least transparency of any continent on earth. For journalists, that's a terrible impediment because they have to necessarily rely solely on human sources for their information, and that ends up becoming factionalism involving this party or that party, and you can't get two sources even. They're happy with one source. It becomes a lot more opinion-based journalism. And of course, it's all underfunded, and even money for travel and other things doesn't exist. There have been all kinds of efforts to boost journalism in those parts of the world, and there have been nonprofits actually started in about 5 or 7 countries, but all of them are almost totally unfunded or barely funded, hanging by a thread, and they disappear after a year or two. It's been very difficult. The most success probably has in Africa, and there's a group called FAIR which tries to train and assist journalists not only here in Africa but throughout the continent. But it is the most difficult part of all. Bill Gates and his initiatives with health, he was not remotely interested in journalism at all. He was interested in the AIDS issues and getting medicines there. And then he realized corruption was so severe, maybe journalism would be useful. And suddenly there was a new interest in training journalists there. But all of these things, the problem with these types of funding is they're episodic. They come, they go, but there's nothing sustained there that's stable beyond a grant for a year or two. And I think that Africa has easily been the most difficult place on earth to sustain this kind of reporting and this kind of effort, including quote-unquote nonprofit journalism. So I don't have any magic answers there. I think I try to encourage journalists from that part of the world to, the one thing they do have is information about their societies that's not from there, from the 500 plus reports the UN and all the related multilateral bodies puts out, tells them about infant mortality and all these other statistics about their own country, their own society, that they're not going to get in the news locally any other way. We know that 60% of the world or more has access to mobile phones. That's great. Many people in parts of Africa don't have computers at all. The best they have is mobile phones. I think some of the future evolution of reporting, investigative reporting, and other types of journalism in that part of the world is going to have to necessarily adapt to be on mobile phones, and I also think the funding models clearly at this moment are not working well. I think it's fair to just acknowledge that. And I've seen a lot of experiments, and so far none of them have worked terribly well. So I sort of kind of concur with what you were asking there. I think that's my impression as well.
Anybody got a solution?
I agree, it's a huge problem, and it's very quick for the investigative journalism in highly corrupted societies to just become part of the problem. That I talked to one group of journalists, almost all of whom admitted that they had engaged in a fascinating practice of doing a significant investigative reporting job on something or someone, then going to the person or the organization and saying, how much will you pay me not to write this story? So they were getting richer and richer every story they didn't write. So the distortions are shocking. I know there were some donors when I first got involved in this that were funding training efforts and then trying to measure the success of those training efforts, and they did it by the number of stories that were published about corruption. And they just counted them up, and they said, well, there are lots of them, so we must be succeeding. And the stories were simply political attacks that one person said somebody else was corrupt, and the reporter took dictation and it went, you know.
I mean, it's important, just for fairness, to say that, one, that when we say things about Africa, we're talking about some places in Africa. There have been some good things have happened in Africa. We have a lot of growth happening in Africa, and the media has been benefited from that. And these practices by individual journalists, I've talked to a lot of journalists in Africa about these kinds of practices, and they are as humiliated by these practices as we are, as we would be. And it's horrible for them to live in those kinds of conditions, because they're driven to this because they don't get salary. So it's part of the system, and it's a systematic problem of, you know, the way that these institutions are being set up. And part of our challenge is to reiterate that we have to have strong institutions to make journalism and to make media, you know, function. And I think it was one of the big failures of the World Bank, where Tim and I spent a good bit of part of our career, was that we never found a way to integrate media institutional reforms into the broader reforms that the World Bank was talking about in these countries. We did in the early days of the change after, you know, the Soviet Union fell apart, and there were a lot of people who really understood that process, that you needed to talk about transparency, and you needed to talk about this specific, you know, public sector side of creating media institutions that the public sector holds all the keys to. You need to bring that into the discussion about everything else, and it needs to be on the table. And when it is, sometimes you can get it right. But when it's not, then you have a really high chance that the people who are vying for power, vying for influence, will compete and capture different parts of the media. And journalists are at the lowest level of this this pecking order, and they become, you know, the people who get victimized the most by this, because they're not paid, and they're left to fend for themselves in an environment that is absolutely unconducive to them upholding, you know, good reporting practices and integrity. Okay, I think I had you asking me. Okay.
Well, my name's Willie Schubert. I work with Internews, and I'm really happy to hear the focus on livelihoods for journalists as part of this discussion. And I kind of have a tandem question for both Chuck and Dick. You mentioned at the start of ProPublica the importance of getting that mention in the New York Times. And I'm wondering, as these kinds of things are internationalized, what's the role that traditional media plays in starting nonprofit media? And similarly for Chuck, that association point that you brought together, this consortium and this roster of really highly trained expert people, and that there's a lot of talent around the world, can you explore a little bit more deeply the role that the association plays in building up that capability for individuals?
So let me take that first part quickly.
That question, just let me add this too, because we're getting some questions online, and IJNet, someone from IJNet is asking, how do you nurture investigative reporting in cultures where corruption is rampant? So it's a little bit of the same kind of question, so you can take two questions at the same time.
On the traditional media, we've had great success in having the traditional media help us get distribution in the near term. What I would say is we're trying to do two things, and I think this would be true of almost anybody, any place. You're trying to get distribution so your stories can have impact in whatever direction you want them to in the short run. And there, traditional media, if you can forge partnerships, and in this country it's become relatively standard to be able to do that, but it took some work, can help you do that. The second thing you want to be doing at the same time is to build a platform of your own, because all these, at least in my judgment, and because all these changes are not going to stop. And indeed, many of the partners that you would look to depend on now may not be there, or may not be there in the same strength down the road. So I think you want to be doing both of those things at the same time and for both of those reasons.
Let's take another question.
I know, Chuck, there was a second one.
Okay, sorry.
Your question about the consortium, I think the best thing the consortium does for the individual members is all those members are located in individual countries, and they don't have the money or the training or the know-how or anything to do something in another part of the world, or even in a neighboring country. And what they all so enjoy is knowing there's kindred souls elsewhere who also are interested in investigating this company or this phenomenon or that issue. And there is a secure way in which they can all communicate with each other. And there are specialists, tech type folks who can walk them through databases. When you get 2 or 3 million secret bank records, in the first secrecy for sale report, it was so complex that after 7 or 8 months they had to scratch the database. No one could access it. They couldn't figure it out because you have journalists of varying ages and proficiency in terms of computer use. Scratch the first one and build a second one that would work for everyone and be more accessible. But so there's a lot of trial and error. Things are not always perfect. But what they most enjoy, the loneliest job on planet Earth, possibly could be being an investigative reporter, especially in much of the world, and having other folks who know how you think, know what you're working on. You know there's others looking at similar subjects. Most of these subjects transcend borders. That is, you can't put a price tag on it, and it's immensely valuable. I mean, invaluable for all of these folks. And so it's really exciting to watch, actually. It's very inspiring.
I'm Jonathan Levy with the Federal Communications Commission. I have a question about something that's been touched on implicitly in the discussion of, or the mention of tax policy and also government-funded journalism, which is, what, if any, role is there for public policy in facilitating or encouraging or supporting this sector of the journalism ecosystem?
Well, Chuck mentioned this at the beginning, we've been talking about it earlier. I think it would make an enormous difference in other countries to have a tax system like our own that provided some tax advantage to building up the nonprofit sector generally and nonprofit journalism as one example of that. It certainly makes a very big difference to us. You know, there are studies about how much, and I won't argue with those and wade into that thicket, but I will just tell you as somebody who spends a lot of his time out there raising money, there is some money that we get without question that we would get irrespective of our tax system. There is some that we don't. That we simply would not. That we do, that we would not.
This person on Twitter is asking, are you worried about foundations exerting influence over the nonprofit news business?
No, it's a short answer. You know, individuals and foundations or companies, when you work in the commercial media, they can try to exert influence. I think it's the job of the editor and the publisher, sometimes that's actually the same person, to resist that pressure and stand up to it and refuse to do it. And there are telltale signs when you see indications of that. You have to vet whoever it is that's funding you. You have to be sure you're comfortable accepting money from them in the first place. And if they have an obvious agenda, or even not so obvious, but it worries you, you don't do it. Bottom line, and transparency is very important. All of the members of a network of 100 nonprofits in the U.S. that was formed a few years ago that Dick and I are part of, one of the cardinal rules of it is you must disclose your donors, and that helps in terms of transparency and being the best disinfectant in terms of information about that. I think that's relevant and helpful. But it could happen, sure, but it could happen, and it has happened with commercial advertising too. So I think everything is relative, and you have to gauge it and monitor it. There does have to be a wall in your newsroom. I've always tried to keep my staff at arm's length from the donor folks, to be honest with you.
Yeah, so this is kind of a simple question out of the nonprofit journalism playbook, but when you're having your work published, a lot of people say, oh, I'm going to have the ProPublica model and I'm going to get my work published in this newspaper or with this online site. Is there a money exchange there? Like, if ProPublica's reporters are doing most of the work, or CIR's reporters are doing most of the work, does the New York Times or, you know, NPR, whoever, then give money in exchange for that?
Mostly not.
Okay.
Wherever we can convince them to, yes, and I hope over time more so, but you know, if you go back again to why we're doing this
It's to
and
help
why
them.
it makes sense, it's because they don't have the money.
Exactly. Yeah.
In most cases. And where they do have the money, because a lot of people say, well, yes, but you know, they are still, many of these news organizations nominally profitable, and some of them more than nominally. Part of it is, just as a practical matter, the partnership model, in my experience, works at its best when it's a newsroom-to-newsroom thing. And if you want to put money in the equation, it's not just a newsroom-to-newsroom thing. You've got to get the partner's business side involved, because the newsroom doesn't have money at its disposal, by and large, for that. And that tends to make it more complicated and slower and ultimately less often successful.
Hi, Jim Rowe. I guess I'm here for the Argentine Journalist Forum. And I wonder if you could discuss a little bit about sustaining the nonprofit model. I think ProPublica's done a marvelous job. Chuck seems to do everything right. But you get to the Chicago Reader, was it? You get the Bay Citizen, you get a whole bunch of these local organizations like Phoenix. They've sprung from declining operations in their own cities. They've done really good journalism, but haven't been able to sustain the initial nonprofit push. And I'm just wondering, how do you build a nonprofit model that works over the long run?
First crack?
For you know, a less global organization than, say, Steve.
You know, it's a peculiar start something from scratch, and it's not for the faint of heart. And starting something up takes years of stamina and staving off disaster on an hourly or daily basis. And it's not cut out for some people. In the case of the Chicago model, the folks who started it was started by a group. Whenever a group starts something, it's not going to work, in my opinion. There's got to be an alpha character who's going to be awake at 3 in the morning worrying about it, and that's actually on their neck initially. Some of the startups have started up as committees. I think that's a disaster. And I could actually point to a few in particular. That's not the only reason that they have failed. I'm not saying that exactly. If you're in a heavy media situation, and in terms of a city, which Chicago has always been the most media-heavy cities in America, that's not always the case lately, I realize, and it's changed. But I think the environment, the purpose, and all of those things are related. If you're trying to do what other folks do already, or you don't distinguish yourself, there's other reasons why things fail. But bottom line is, this is very tricky stuff, and it still comes down to a social entrepreneur willing to put it all on the line personally. And if you don't have that initially, and there's not one person in charge of it, at least initially, in my experience, it's not going to work.
I would say 3 things. One, revenue diversification is critical, and mostly that means the diversification of your philanthropic resources as quickly as possible, as widely as possible. Second, I think it turns out, at least in this country, that individual donors, whether they're operating through their own checkbook or through a family foundation, doesn't really make any difference, are preferable donors to institutional foundations. And we greatly appreciate the support we get from institutional foundations, but not institutional foundations as places where it is people's jobs to give away someone else's money, where that person is usually dead. Those are very different places. They, by their nature, and I used to work at one, and they do wonderful work, but they have to have evolving agendas. They have to be, to a certain extent, fickle. They have to have shorter attention spans than individual donors. At least it's our experience and my observation with others that individual donors to nonprofit journalism are liked probably just the same way you are with however you make your own charitable contributions, which is you find places that appeal to you, move you in one way or another, and if they continue to do the work that appealed to you at the same level, you'll probably give to them year after year. With schools and hospitals and other things, sometimes people literally give money to these places 40 years in a row. That is true of individual giving. So that's point 2. Those are, in the long run, more. Third most important point is these places, like everything else, are businesses. They've got to be run as businesses. If you have some thought that, we don't really have to run this as a business, it's a mission and the Lord will provide, perhaps, but history suggests perhaps not.
Okay.
My first question is for Tim in particular. My name is Vera. I'm in Malaysia. And the model of Malaysia Kini and their business model and such, what do you think of the other independent media outlets that do not have a paywall, like the Malaysian Insider, Free Malaysia Today, Chronicle, whatever? Like, what do you think of those models? And with Malaysia's increasingly tightened press, how do you think that will be sustainable in the future?
the model without the paywall, how will that go? Malaysia Insider, which got going after the launch of Malaysia Kini, maybe some people feel Malaysia Kini sort of opened the way for a number of others. That's probably the most serious one, and the one that I know the editors at Malaysia Kini take very seriously and watch, and it's good. Their position on the paywall, you know, that was they're juggling this. They are trying to get a diversified advertising base. And I think the problem with Malaysia Kini is that they were really dependent in the early days on advertising from the .com sector. So when that blew up in the early 2000s, they were in real trouble. Insider seems to have a somewhat more diverse you know, advertising base, but whether that's going to continually and sustainably provide them with adequate revenue is a big question. And I think that, you know, there's, you know, they could debate this, but I think that's going to be their fragile point.
Okay, look, this has been a terrific conversation. I want to thank all three of our panelists for joining us. It's been, you know, an important conversation for the media development community. We want to try to make as much of this as part of an ongoing work that we're doing on the role of the private sector and how these different communities, the private and foundation sector and the donors interact with each other. And one conclusion that I've drawn is that the media development challenge is far from being over, so CIMA is still going to be around for the foreseeable future. And I want to thank all of you for coming, and thanks to the Open Gov Hub for letting us use the facilities, and we hope to see you again online. Thankful for those who watched online, and we hope we can continue the conversation with questions and comments online. So thank you for coming.